Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today at your Pushback channel. While you're with us, please take a moment to subscribe below and remember to click the bell symbol to receive notifications. This essay considers the issues surrounding why SJW cultural Marxist propagandists say all colonialism was oppression, particularly white colonialism. These sentiments are part of a global anti-male, anti-white middle-class propaganda bandwagon. It is now very fashionable amongst cultural Marxists to portray all white colonialism as bad and all other colonials as good, or at least not as bad as white colonialism. It is time there was some pushing back against these detestable and inaccurate anti-white propaganda narratives. Everywhere one cares to look, so-called lectures by various very well-funded propagandists abound from former European colonies who are asserting the most fantastic myths as fact. No interviewer or audience Q&A challenges or doubts these ridiculous or absurdly cherry-picked claims that are then reported by the cultural Marxist anti-Western media as undisputed fact. It's all pointedly very anti-white and particularly anti-white male. So let's have a look at what really happened, and you'll quickly see that for all its faults, so-called white colonialism modernised much of the world. So to suggest colonialism only brought disbenefit is a grotesque untruth and a view unique to cultural Marxist sociology fetish seeking. For those who are very keen to trash white colonialism with the utmost and extreme prejudice, why are they so much less keen to similarly denounce the very long and often cruelly oppressive history of, say, Arabic colonialism and Islamic colonialism, the Han Chinese colonialism, or the African Zulus, not to mention the Vandals, the Goths and the Mongol hordes? On an overall brutishness scale, white colonialism was positively benign by comparison. If you really wanted to pick the most oppressive colonial regimes, white colonials wouldn't even make it into the top 10. White colonialism is in historical terms a rather recent phenomenon. The previous 6,000 years of non-white colonialism, some of it genocidal, for some reason it barely rates a mention from current leftist commentators. We don't see or hear of any condemnation of the non-white colonial empires. White colonialism began quite slowly in the late 1400s and onwards, and unsurprisingly coincides with the advent of advanced ship and sail technology for long ocean voyages. It all started with the establishment of small trading posts and developed from there. Europeans were the first to develop long ocean voyage ship technology. So Europeans were technologically more advanced and able to develop commercial interest internationally across oceans. Is it fair, reasonable or accurate to assert colonialism is a white issue or principally a white technological development? Colonialism is not new and was practiced within the limits of the technology of the day by numerous empires of the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin, mostly but not all Arabic, for the first 6,000 years or so of ancient history. Examples are the Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Egyptian and Moorish empires, to name a few. Between the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad and the eviction of the Muslims from Granada in southern Spain, the Moorish colonial empire stretching from North India through North Africa to Spain lasted almost 800 years. The Turkish Ottoman Empire, which was also Islamic, encompassed most of the Middle East, stretching as far as the gates of Vienna in Europe, at its extremity lasted for nearly 600 years. The so-called white empires of Rome and Greece accounted for a small portion of the empire timelines, statistically about 4 or 5% or less of ancient and up to medieval history. In Asia, the Mongol Empire and China were active in empire building around Asia, including an unsuccessful invasion of Japan in 1280. The Chinese Empire stretched from the north of Sakhalin to modern-day Singapore, with influential outposts all across Asia. The first European settled trading post outside of Greater Europe, North Africa, was the Portuguese settlement in a province of India, starting in 1503 and concentrating on the pepper trade. India was not a nation at the time, but rather a patchwork of religious and political states and petty fiefdoms permanently at war with one another. India, or rather northern India, had been invaded by the Mughal or Muslim Empire in 1526, creating a lack of political unity amongst the Indian states at the time, who were ever ready to welcome and seek assistance from foreigners in their petty disputes with neighbouring fiefdoms. Following this Mughal invasion, the Hindu and Muslim Indian tribes were in a state of warfare and civil war for more than 100 years, to the mid-1700s. Additional Portuguese trading posts were acquired through becoming involved in seeking advantage from India's internal strife and petty tribal warfare. Many additional trading posts were established in Asia and India, including Goa, Macau, Ceylon and Timor over the next 40 years. From the mid-1490s, the Spanish began colonising the Caribbean and Central America, later extending control over all of South America in conjunction with Portugal, as well as parts of modern-day United States, in addition to other outposts such as the Philippines. By the late 1600s, large parts of Europe had been colonised by Islamic, Turkish or Ottoman Empire, including most of modern-day Spain, Greece, Serbia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and parts of Slovenia and Slovakia, and even what today would be eastern parts of Austria. A visitor to Greece in the 1700s would have noticed it was a province of the Islamic, Turkish, Ottoman Empire, and the famous Acropolis in Athens had been turned into a Muslim bazaar, with Arab shopkeepers selling Arabic rugs. Muslims had controlled much of Spain until 1492. Later, other colonial enterprises from Holland and France would take shape, while Britain, not entering the Empire Stakes until the late 1500s and early 1600s, was quite a latecomer to colonialism. Okay, so we've established why colonials were a relatively modern phenomenon, initially at least, set out to trade rather than conquer. The current propaganda being put about by cultural Marxists fancifully asserts that the areas colonised by the white Europeans were rich, unified, technically advanced, populated by peaceful peoples of impeccable moral virtue. Now, this is total rubbish. Do we really believe that everywhere brown and black folks walked around playing harps, smiling at one another, swimming in celestial fountains of milk and honey, and then along came the big, bad white men and spoilt the angelic party? Such an assertion is beyond nonsense and sounds more like some silly made-up story to scare and dupe impressionable children with invented bogeymen. Moreover, the sneering moral condescension directed at whites inherent in these concoctions around the rewriting of history is in itself mind-boggling. Whites are now being presented ideologically as being culturally and morally inferior race, deserving of the harshest Marxist class warfare condemnations. Silly gossip stories that would struggle to make it into a teenage girl's magazine abound about colonial massacres of black and brown people. Acts of cruelty are invented and hysterically popularised and embellished. Each luridly described fake atrocity supposedly was unprovoked and directed at peace-loving natives by those white devils. But was white colonialism any more or less benign, or even more or less brutal than any other form of colonialism? Should it be singled out for specific condemnation that may separate it somehow from all the other types of colonialism that went before? Today, members of the commentariat try and outdo each other with tall stories of alleged white colonial wickedness. In one of the many examples of what is gleefully described by cultural Marxists as a massacre of innocent native worshippers from the early 1900s, was in reality a situation where the local colonial authorities had established a curfew in the area due to a number of murders and deaths because of religious unrest between local tribes and religions. Similarly, Marxist agitators in the pay of the Soviet Bolsheviks were also stirring up unrest and putting authorities on edge. Now, posters and signs were spread around the city and main entrance roads to the city advising of the curfew. Town criers verbally also delivered the curfew messages around the city to make sure it was widely known. Whipped up by local agitators, a large crowd of more than 15,000 had assembled in the city contrary to curfew requirements. Many of them were armed with clubs and machetes. The crowd was ordered to disperse. When the crowd refused, and while reports of more deaths in the region were coming in, along with acts of sabotage and armed sabotage, which included cutting of the telephone and telegraph lines, and with the gathering of these unruly mobs, the local authorities, not surprisingly, sent a military detachment to order the crowd to disperse under threat of being fired upon. At first they were shooting in the air, and the crowd still appeared to make no effort to disperse. However, as the soldiers were unaware, they were positioned at the main entrance exit, leaving only 4 narrower exits for the large crowd to exit the area. As the firing began, mayhem ensued and people were trampled in the rush. As the military detachments used less than half the minimal amount of ammunition they had brought, it's hard to perceive any premeditated malice and racism, as is now being alleged by some fairly hysterical race activists. Local agitators had wanted a martyrdom propaganda moment, and understandably nervous colonial authorities, handily outnumbered by the armed elements of the crowd, had unwittingly given them one. It would have been better all round if no shooting had occurred and if no armed crowd had gathered in the first place, contrary to curfew instructions. But does the activist presentation of this issue hold up as an example of white racism and malice? Definitely not. Another favourite cultural Marxist method is to create colonial atrocity fantasies by omission of key facts. One exceptionally well-connected nationalist patrician, third world propagandist, who very fancifully positions himself as a victim's representative, spreads the falsehood that colonial authorities ordered all natives to crawl on all fours as part of some evil colonial humiliation and racism. The reality is a little different, and this just shows how much these activists try and take things out of context and omit key facts. The order to crawl was indeed given, but it was in just one narrow laneway of a large city. The reason for this was the assault and beating in that laneway of a middle-aged female missionary, where a native crowd had beaten her with clubs, then pursued her along the alley for a second beating. No one had come to her aid, and her attempts to enter doorways to escape the mob resulted in her being pushed back into the street and the doors being slammed in her face. This, along with other assaults and murders in that district around the city, had authorities understandably feeling a little edgy. Now, locals allegedly bragging about how they'd beaten up the middle-aged female missionary probably didn't help a tense situation. As the colonial authorities could not identify the perpetrators, nobody would come forward, who had beaten the missionary, they demanded that the residents of that laneway must prostrate themselves in prayer, seeking forgiveness and atonement for their crimes. This was the same crawl prostration position used for prayer. Propagandists have recast this event as something that happened everywhere and all over, and the propaganda pitch, it was some form of racist humiliation, which it was not. And once you get the facts on that sort of thing, you can start to see what was really going on there. Colonial authorities also frequently put a stop to barbaric practices they encountered, something the propagandists somehow failed to mention when they invented alleged white misdeeds. Colonial authorities frequently put a stop to barbaric practices they encountered, something the propagandists somehow failed to mention when they talk about the invented and alleged white misdeeds. In one region, more than 100,000 women were burned each year because the dowry paid by the bride's family was deemed as insufficient. Also, millions died from famines and pestilence before white colonials had even appeared, a fact again left out of all the activist propaganda stories. Then they say bad things only started to happen in these places the moment that the white folks turned up, which is of course nonsense. Before that, they say it was all a blissful paradise. Does anyone actually believe that? You'll notice in the talk shows and when these people are being interviewed, the talk show hosts don't even ask the questions. They just accept whatever's asserted by these activists, and the conversation just goes on. White Europeans were frequently shocked at what they saw, such as brown children being dismembered while still alive as a sacrifice to the gods. Cannibalism. And they did genuinely try to stop these and other similar excesses. Now, colonial economics had nothing to do with racism either then or now. It was always economics first. Pepper, for example, that could be acquired cheaply at local prices in the East, say India or Indonesia, could at one time sell for the same price as gold. While transport was expensive, the commercial attraction of the spice trade was obvious, and with profits of such magnitude at stake, the idea of race or racism barely entered into it, if at all. But similarly, the risks were very high with those old sailing ships and the weather and so on. Insurance was hard to come by and very expensive. However, just as today, different values and attitudes did play a significant role, nonetheless, to conflate all of this to race issues alone is absurd. Europeans used what today we would call contract law to negotiate trade deals. But not all peoples native to Africa or wider Arabia, the Indian subcontinent and Asia understood these concepts. For Europeans who must undertake high risk and expensive sea voyages, it was commercially very important the other party honoured the contract deal to sell X tons of spice at an agreed price come the time and come the season for collection. contracts were often made 12 months in advance. Now, misunderstanding the high financial stakes for the Europeans, many natives traders saw the contract or the European contract as some worthless piece of paper, leaving them free to arbitrarily change their mind and the conditions of the agreement, including the price and so on. Now, understandably, this frequently led to disputation and even armed conflict, where the technically superior Europeans would mostly prevail. Given the European view that native traders were unreliable and duplicitous, any backsliding from a commercial agreement was seen as a provocation, with often unpleasant outcomes. Warfare and annexations as part of the wider colonial exercise were also more a case of economics than any specific desire to be colonialists. If the main supply of spice is cut off by two other petty fiefdoms constantly at war with one another, the colonialists may try various means to gain access to the spices, for example, and then out of exasperation demand safe passage through the warring territory. And when this does not work out, then they'll directly intervene and they'll either annex a territory or a region, or they'll install a puppet ruler or some other means of... but this was all about guaranteeing supply and giving that certainty and stability to the region. The colonials wanted peace and stability. War and conflict was expensive and disruptive. For many parts of the colonial empires, it was the longest period of peace that they had enjoyed for centuries. So the Europeans, because they needed peace and stability to do their business and particularly during the mercantile age and later, because they needed this stability and peace, they brought peace to the region as a byproduct. Now, surely this must mean something to a region that had been in war and civil war and petty war for hundreds of years, and now they've got peace because the Europeans have arrived. Surely that must mean something, because it would seem fairly positive you can get 100 years of peace after the previous 100 years has been petty warfare. Another absurd myth is the alleged huge pre-colonial GDP wealth of areas colonised by Europeans. Now, such calculations that suggest all the areas that the Europeans colonised were fabulously wealthy before Europeans arrived is nonsense. Such calculations require a terrible sleight of hand, much favoured by the cultural Marxists. By loosely calculating the European sell price of things like spices such as pepper, the Marxist mathematicians inflate the local native GDP by almost 20-fold, so that they make it 20 times richer than it really is. But the reality is that native growers could not store and transport such a cargo like pepper or cinnamon to the markets in Europe. They just didn't have the technology or the capacity or the know-how to do it. But those items were only of value in Europe. They were quite cheap and easy to acquire in the East. To move them in bulk, of course, to Europe, where the high prices were, that was a different matter, and only the Europeans had that technology. So local native prices for things like cinnamon and pepper were many times less than European prices. So when GDP is measured in those terms, the colonised areas had latent wealth only, but only European technology. Only by adding European technology could those items, such as the spices, actually realise their maximum value. So the Europeans were adding that value by transport and storing. The next cultural Marxist-based colonial whitesmith is the claims that native states or regions possess much higher GDP than Europeans by using the five-card trick of total population mass. So by using one human as equaling one unit of production, India and China, for example, possessed a larger total mass GDP because they had a much larger population. So by that they try and infer that places like China and India, again, were fabulously wealthy, much wealthier than Europeans, but in fact that wasn't the case. It's a deception to feed the narrative that the rich nations, the rich European nations, acquired all their wealth by stealing it, which of course is nonsense. This is a grotesque untruth. Even before the Industrial Revolution and before the main phase of the mercantile age, even the poorest European nations possessed a higher per capita GDP than China or India or any of the areas that were colonised or part colonised by whites. Even before material colonisation had begun, Indian per capita GDP was less than two-thirds that of Britain and half that of Holland. In the 100 years of religious civil war leading up to the 1750s, the non-unified Indian subcontinent states and the principalities per capita GDP declined even further, and this is before Europeans had been particularly present in India. The notion hungrily being put about by anti-white propagandists is that colonial regions failed to advance technically at the same rate as Western industrialised nations, allegedly due to being held back or kept down by the evil white oppressor. Now, this again is simply not true. India, for example, continued to grow its GDP during colonial rule, but not at the same rate as the European states that industrialised and engaged in labour-saving devices such as the spinning jenny, the steam engine and so on. Thus, those regions that did not industrialise grew, but they just grew at a slower rate, which is what you'd expect. Now, other regions that were not affected by colonialism, that also did not industrialise, they also grew at about the same rate as, say, China or India, suggesting that the colonialism really had not much effect one way or another. The idea that whites stole all the wealth is totally debunked. Moreover, most of the infrastructure, including acres under crop and so on, were introduced by the colonists to produce wealth that would not have occurred if the colonists had not arrived. Both China and India possessed a very large craft-based population. They were still hand-weaving cloth into the 1800s, so any form of production automation was viewed as culturally and religiously perverse. By 1890, British textile factories could outproduce China and India combined, and that's from a population of less than 30 million in Britain at the time. Another blatant inventor white atrocity myth is that British colonialists supposedly cut off the thumbs of Indian weavers so they could not work. Indian nationalists keenly put this one about today, knowing it is an outrageous falsehood. If even a grain of truth is to be found here, it is more likely the weavers who were forced to work for increasingly meagre wages in a caste system and who could not escape their class Indian-based indenturing, they self-mutilated rather than continue in such a caste-based servitude. Some areas were colonised by Europeans simply to prevent a rival power from gaining influence in the region, and not part of some racial oppression or desire to oppress or even to colonise. Colonisation was actually rarely a first preference, with a negotiated arrangement offering reliability and stability and continuity almost always seen as a better first option. Similarly, colonisation typically took place where nation-states of identifiable government did not exist and where tribal warfare with a heritage going back thousands of years was all pervasive. Many colonial military actions were to restore peace or end disruption to commerce. Did battles take place where brown people and their soldiers were trying to kill white colonial soldiers, and of course the reverse? Of course they did. Are these all examples of some white atrocity? Of course not. Was colonialism, or white, brown or black colonialism, perfect in every respect? With nearly all colonialism throughout history, the intention was to invade and convert. White European, with perhaps the notable exception of Spain, was a colonialism based around trade economics first and foremost, and not conquest or conversion as first priority, although that did happen in some instances. This, in my view, makes European colonialism, on balance, while not perfect, the least oppressive of all colonial empires throughout history, and deserving of that recognition. And if white colonialism is to be condemned, then so must all others before it, including all brown and all black empires for their murderous brutality. This is Tacitus Today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening. We hope you found this video informative. All our essays are available in printed book format, and please select your choice of any 14 essays via the email address below.